Picture this. 200 guests dressed in their finest, champagne glasses raised, waiting for a picture-perfect wedding toast. And right when the spotlight was supposed to shine on the bride and groom, my own mother slapped me so hard across the face, my earring flew across the marble floor. Why? Because I refused to hand over the keys to my multi-million-dollar home. They thought public humiliation would break me, but what they didn't know was that I had a card up my sleeve, one that would turn their little celebration into the downfall they never saw coming. My name is Madison Hayes, and I'm 32 years old. What I'm about to share isn't just a family drama, it's a story that still sends shockwaves through our city's business community. If you've ever been treated like the lesser child in your own family, ignored despite your accomplishments, or made to feel invisible while everyone praises your sibling, then you're going to understand exactly what I went through. It all began on the morning of my younger sister Sophia's wedding. The venue was the Grand View Hotel, a place straight out of a bridal magazine. Crystal chandeliers glittered above the ballroom. White roses climbed every column, and gold accents sparkled on every table setting. It was everything Sophia had dreamed of since she was a little girl. And of course, it had to be perfect, because Sophia was always the princess of the family. Me, I was the shadow in the background, the practical daughter, the one who, according to my mother, put career before love. I arrived early, 3 hours before the ceremony, hoping to slip into the background and avoid unnecessary conversations. But the moment I stepped into the ballroom in my navy silk dress, my mother zeroed in on me. "Madison, finally," she said, her eyes flicking up and down my figure. "That dress, couldn't you have chosen something more feminine? You look like you're heading to a board meeting, not your sister's wedding." I smoothed down the fabric. It was elegant, understated. And yes, something I could wear to a high-stakes negotiation, just as easily as to a wedding. "Good morning to you too, Mom," I replied evenly. She ignored my words, her gaze already drifting toward Sophia, who was laughing with the bridesmaids. "Doesn't she look radiant in her gown? A proper bride. You should see how she glows." The comparison wasn't new. For 32 years, I'd been the daughter who was too ambitious, too independent, too masculine. Sophia was the delicate one, the sweet one, the perfect one. And in my family's eyes, perfect always won. "Madison, can you check the seating arrangements?" My father called out from across the room. "But don't reorganize everything like you always do." I bit my tongue. The seating chart was a disaster. Divorced couples seated side by side, business rivals thrown together at the same table. But correcting it would only prove their point that I was difficult. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just some anonymous office worker. I was Vice President of Development at Hayes Capital, overseeing our Asia-Pacific expansion. My name appeared in the Financial Times more often than theirs ever would. But in this ballroom, none of it mattered. To them, I was still just Madison, the daughter who hadn't settled down. My Aunt Patricia's voice broke through my thoughts. "Not everyone can be as lucky as Sophia, finding true love so young." She said it with that fake sympathy that was really just another jab. Relatives whispered nearby, not even bothering to lower their voices. Still no ring on Madison's finger. All that time in the city, and she's still alone. Poor Carol. At least she has Sophia to give her grandchildren soon. I kept my focus on a crooked centerpiece, straightening it with steady hands. I had heard it all before. My cousin Derek smirked from across the room. "Hey, Madison, maybe if you spent less time in boardrooms and more time in normal rooms, you'd have a +1 today." The laughter rippled like a wave. I wanted to tell them about the men I dated, men who couldn't handle my success, who called me too much because I made more money, had more ambition, and demanded more from life. But what would be the point? They didn't want explanations. They wanted reasons to dismiss me. "She's just very particular," my mother chimed in loudly, making sure everyone could hear. Always too picky for her own good. I smiled tightly and adjusted another centerpiece. They had no idea who I really was, and maybe that was for the best. Then Aunt Sally swooped in. "So, Madison," she said with a chirp, "how's that little apartment of yours in the city? Must be cozy." "It's a penthouse, actually," I replied quietly. The group burst into laughter. Sally wiped tears from her eyes. "A penthouse? Oh, Madison, you and your big city dreams?" "She likes to exaggerate," Sophia added with a practiced laugh, gliding over in her bridal gown. "Last year, she said she was buying a Tesla. Can you imagine?" I did buy a Tesla, I said softly, but nobody heard me over their chuckles. Madison's always been ambitious, Mom added in that tone that made ambition sound like a flaw. Too ambitious, really. There's nothing wrong with a modest apartment, Uncle Tom cut in, patting my shoulder like I was a child. Not everyone can afford luxury. No shame in that, kiddo. My phone buzzed in my clutch. A notification from my building's concierge. Tomorrow's delivery scheduled for my 4,500 square foot penthouse on the 45th floor. The one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The one I had paid for in cash after closing the Singapore deal. But I said nothing. I just smiled politely. You're right, Uncle Tom. There's no shame in living within your means. Sophia laughed, the sound delicate and perfect. See? Madison's finally learning to be realistic, and there it was again, that invisible wall between us. To them, I was still a girl playing at being successful. They didn't know that every square foot of that penthouse was proof of my sacrifices. 10 years of 80-hour weeks. 10 years of red-eye flights, missed holidays, deals worth millions. That home wasn't just property, it was my sanctuary. And deep down, I already knew one thing. I would never give it up. Not for them. Not for anyone. What I didn't realize yet was that by the end of that day, they were going to demand exactly that on the grandest stage possible. And when I refused, the entire room, and eventually the entire city, would hear my mother scream. The weeks after that dinner felt like walking on cracked glass. Every step forward came with the risk of cutting myself open again. I kept my head down at work, doubled my hours at the firm, and tried to drown out the noise of family drama with contracts, filings, and endless stacks of legal jargon. But no matter how hard I tried, the whispers of that night echoed in my head, my mother's icy command, my brother's smirk, the suffocating silence when I dared to stand my ground. For a while, I thought maybe it would all blow over. Maybe they'd lick their wounds, realize I wasn't a child they could bully anymore, and let me live my life. But the universe had other plans. 2 months later, I received a gilded envelope in the mail. Heavy paper, thick cursive writing, and my name etched across it like a taunt. My parents were hosting an engagement party for Daniel. Not just any party. A grand celebration at a 5-star hotel ballroom, complete with a guest list that read like a who's who of the city's elite. I stared at the invitation for what felt like hours. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation. It was bait. They wanted me there as a prop, to smile through clenched teeth and pretend everything was perfect. The prodigal daughter returning, humbly standing in the shadows while her golden brother basked in the light. I almost threw the envelope in the trash. Almost. But then I caught myself. If I stayed away, they'd win. They'd twist the narrative, paint me as bitter, jealous, ungrateful. If I showed up, at least, I could control my own story, even if it meant walking into the lion's den. So I RSVP'd yes. The day of the party, I stood in front of my mirror for longer than I cared to admit. I didn't pick the flashiest gown or the most daring heels. Instead, I chose a sleek black dress that whispered confidence instead of screaming for attention. I wanted to look untouchable, not like I was competing with anyone. When I arrived at the hotel, the lobby was buzzing with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Chandeliers dripped crystal light onto marble floors, and every corner smelled of roses and expensive champagne. My brother was already holding court near the stage, his fiancée on his arm. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. Perfect smile, flawless dress, the kind of woman my parents had always imagined standing beside their son. I kept my distance, mingling with distant relatives and old family friends. But it didn't take long before my mother's sharp gaze cut through the crowd and found me. Her lips curved into a smile, but her eyes stayed cold. "Darling," she said as she approached, her voice dripping with sugar. "So glad you could make it." It wasn't an invitation, it was a test. The night wore on, and the speeches began. Toasts about love, loyalty, and family filled the air, each one more nauseating than the last. Then, right when the champagne was flowing and the music softened, my mother tapped her glass with a silver spoon. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice amplified through the microphone, "before we move on, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge both of my children." The spotlight swung toward me, my stomach dropped. She motioned me forward, her manicured hand outstretched like she was offering me grace. I walked slowly, heels clicking against the polished floor, every eye in the room burning into me. "This," she said to the crowd, gesturing at me, "is my daughter. Brilliant, hardworking, though a little stubborn at times. A polite chuckle rippled through the guests. "And this," she turned to Daniel, beaming, "is my son, my pride and joy, soon to be married, soon to carry on our family legacy." The crowd erupted into applause. Daniel pulled his fiancée close and kissed her cheek, basking in the glow. And then, with cruel precision, my mother dropped the hammer. "Of course, every family has its challenges," she continued, her tone soft but cutting. "Some of us have trouble letting go of certain things, property, status, grudges. But tonight is about unity, not division. So I'm asking my daughter, here and now, in front of all of you, to do what's right, to hand over the family estate so we may truly move forward in harmony." The room fell into stunned silence. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might shatter my ribs. She hadn't just blindsided me. She'd set a trap, public pressure, social shame. She wanted me to cave in front of everyone. I looked around. Dozens of eyes stared at me, waiting for my answer. My brother smirked, his fiancée hiding a smug smile behind her glass. My father shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. And then, before I could even form a response, my mother reached out, grabbed my wrist, and hissed into the microphone, "Don't embarrass us again." Something inside me snapped. I yanked my hand free, the motion sharper than I intended. The microphone screeched with feedback, and the room collectively gasped. And before I could stop myself, the words spilled out of my mouth like venom. "You want to talk about embarrassment?" I said, my voice trembling but loud enough to echo across the ballroom. "How about the fact that you've been lying to this entire family for years? That this perfect little empire you parade around isn't as spotless as you'd like everyone to believe?" The crowd erupted in murmurs, heads turning, whispers flying like sparks. My mother's face went pale, her mask cracking. Daniel lunged toward me, hissing under his breath, "What the hell are you doing?" But I stood my ground, my pulse racing. Because for the first time I realized I wasn't trapped. I wasn't a pawn in their games. I was holding cards of my own, cards they didn't know I had. And tonight I was ready to play them. The room was buzzing like a swarm of angry bees. Gasps, whispers, and wide-eyed stares followed me as I stood at the microphone, my heart hammering in my chest. For years, I had been the quiet daughter, the one expected to fall in line, to swallow my pride for the sake of appearances. But tonight, under the glow of crystal chandeliers and in front of hundreds of witnesses, I decided to burn the script. "You all see the perfect picture," I said, my voice steadier now. "The power couple, the devoted parents, the son who can do no wrong. But what you don't see, what they've hidden, is the truth." My mother tried to snatch the microphone from my hand, but I pulled back. Her smile was plastered on like drying paint, but her eyes screamed murder. "Sit down," Daniel hissed, his jaw tight. "You're making a fool of yourself." "No," I shot back. "I'm telling the truth. Something this family has forgotten how to do." The crowd murmured louder, some leaning forward, others exchanging nervous glances. The pressure was building, and I knew if I didn't strike now, I'd lose the momentum. So I reached into my clutch, pulled out the small USB drive I had been carrying for weeks, and held it up. "You see, I didn't plan to say this tonight," I continued, my hand trembling slightly. "But since my mother wants to put me on display, let's put all of us on display." I motioned toward the event coordinator standing by the projector. His eyes widened, but after a sharp nod from me, and perhaps curiosity winning over caution, he plugged the USB into the laptop controlling the ballroom screens. And then the walls of the room began to talk. First, an audio recording. My father's voice, sharp and impatient. "We'll transfer the funds into the Cayman account. No one will trace it if we split it through the trust first." Gasps rippled through the room. My brother's fiancée nearly dropped her glass. Next, a series of scanned documents filled the screens. Falsified tax forms, shell company records, and hidden property deeds. Each slide cut deeper into the facade my parents had built, peeling away their polished image layer by layer. "This," I said firmly, turning to the guests, "is your shining example of family values. The people you toast at dinners, the ones who preach loyalty and legacy. Fraud, embezzlement, and enough dirty money to fund 3 lifetimes of lies." The room erupted. Some guests stood whispering frantically. Others glared at my parents with betrayal written across their faces. My mother's mask finally shattered. Her face twisted in rage as she lunged toward the laptop. But I stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Don't bother," I said, my voice cold. Every file has already been backed up. And if anything happens to me, they're scheduled to go straight to the authorities. Tonight was just a preview. Daniel's face drained of color. His fiancée took a step back, her arm slipping from his. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not annoyance, not superiority, fear. "You wouldn't dare," my father growled, finally breaking his silence. "Wouldn't I?" I shot back. "You spent years underestimating me, treating me like a placeholder. But while you were busy propping up your golden boy, I was building my own life, my own strength. And unlike you, I don't need to lie to keep it." The tension was suffocating. The weight of years of silence, of unspoken resentment, pressed down on every corner of that ballroom. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the doors at the back of the hall swung open. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, flashing badges. "IRS, we have some questions about your financial records." The timing was almost poetic. The whispers turned into an uproar. Guests backed away, some slipping out the side doors, not wanting to be caught in the scandal. My parents froze, their faces pale as the agents moved closer. "This is a mistake!" my mother shrieked. "A setup. She's lying." But the projector still glowed with undeniable evidence. The paper trail they thought buried now laid bare for everyone to see. Daniel stepped forward, panic etched across his features. "Mom, Dad..." "Stay out of this," my father snapped, but his voice cracked. The authority, the dominance he always carried, it was gone. The agents moved in, quietly but firmly instructing my parents to come with them for questioning. My mother clawed at my arm as they pulled her away, her nails digging into my skin. "You'll regret this!" she spat, her voice trembling with venom. But for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. I didn't cower. I simply looked her in the eyes and whispered back, "No, you will." As they were escorted out, the room fell into stunned silence. Some guests avoided my gaze, while others looked at me with a strange mix of admiration and fear. I didn't care. The empire my parents built on lies had crumbled, and I was the one who pushed it over the edge. Daniel stood frozen near the stage, his fiancée's hand slipping completely from his. She gave him one last look of disgust before turning and walking out. His lips parted, but no words came out. He looked smaller, weaker, stripped of the arrogance that once defined him. And I walked out of that ballroom with my head held high. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving my family, I was free from them. But freedom, I soon learned, doesn't come without consequences. Because while my parents were being questioned, Daniel wasn't about to let his crown slip without a fight. And I wasn't done with him either. For a few brief days after the engagement party, I let myself believe it was over. My parents were tied up in investigations, their carefully polished reputations now tainted beyond repair. Newspapers buzzed with speculation, and whispers followed my family's name in every social circle that once adored them. I went back to work, back to quiet mornings and late nights, and back to a life that finally felt like my own. But peace has a way of slipping through your fingers when you least expect it. It started with the phone calls, unknown numbers that hung up as soon as I answered. Then came the car that trailed me home one evening, its headlights lingering in my rearview mirror a little too long. And finally, the note slipped under my apartment door. "You think you've won, but you haven't. You'll regret crossing me." No signature, no need for one. I knew exactly who it was from. Daniel. My brother had always lived in the shadow of my parents' ambitions, but unlike them, he didn't crumble when the spotlight dimmed. He grew desperate. And desperation, I knew, was dangerous. I considered ignoring him, letting him stew in the ruins of our family's downfall. But when another message arrived, this one an email with veiled threats about my career, my reputation, even my safety, I realized I couldn't stay passive. Daniel wasn't just lashing out. He was plotting. So I began plotting too. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Daniel was hosting a private dinner with some of his fiancée's wealthy relatives, though from what I'd heard, she was already halfway out the door. He wanted to convince them he still had influence, that he could rise again despite the scandal. I showed up uninvited. The restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place where powerful deals were whispered over overpriced wine. When I walked in, Daniel's face twisted in fury, but the guests greeted me warmly, curiosity sparking in their eyes. "I didn't know you'd be joining us," one of them said with a polite smile. "I wouldn't miss it. I replied smoothly, sliding into an empty chair. After all, what's family without transparency? Daniel's jaw tightened, but he couldn't throw me out without causing a scene. And that was exactly what I was counting on. As the dinner unfolded, I waited. I listened. And then, when the conversation turned toward Daniel's future ventures, I struck. Funny, I said, swirling my glass of wine. How you talk about the future when you haven't even cleaned up the past? The table fell silent. Daniel's eyes burned into mine. What are you implying? One of the guests asked. Oh, just that Daniel here has been creative with numbers, I said, pulling a small folder from my bag. Much like our parents. You see, while they were moving money offshore, Daniel was busy funneling funds through fake companies. I'd show you the proof, but I flipped open the folder, sliding a few copies of incriminating documents across the table. Why ruin the suspense? Gasps, raised eyebrows, whispers. Daniel's face turned crimson. You forged this, he snapped. She's lying. She's always been jealous of me. But the more he ranted, the more desperate he looked. And the guests? They weren't fools. They could smell blood in the water. Jealous? I laughed softly. No, Daniel, I'm not jealous. I'm free. And soon everyone else will be free of you too. He lunged across the table, grabbing the folder, his composure completely shattered. But it was too late. I had already sent digital copies to every guest's email before I even walked through the door. One by one, they excused themselves, leaving Daniel fuming alone. His empire, his last shred of credibility, collapsed in a single evening. I should have felt victorious. And in a way, I did. But as I walked out of that restaurant, I realized something deeper. Revenge doesn't erase the scars. It doesn't make the betrayal hurt any less. But it does something else. It reminds you of your own strength, that you're not the victim anymore, that you never have to be again. Weeks later, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. My parents were still entangled in legal battles, their fortune frozen and their influence gone. Daniel had vanished from the social scene, his name now synonymous with fraud and failure. And me? I was finally living on my own terms. Friends asked if I regretted it, if exposing my family so publicly had been worth it. My answer never changed. Yes, I'd say, because sometimes the only way to free yourself from the chains of a toxic family is to shatter them completely. I set down my glass of wine and let out a long breath. The war was over, not because they surrendered, but because I no longer needed to fight. For the first time in years, I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I wasn't the scapegoat. I was simply me, and that was enough.